Regardless of the medium, Eggman has always attracted a lackey. In Archie, we saw that with his nephew Snively, and in IDW, we would be introduced to Doctor Starline. However, between Eggman's massive ego and the fact that his partners are just as backstabbing in nature as he is, things never seem to go too well for anyone who teams up with Dr. Eggman. So, we're in a unique position where we can look at Starline's rise and fall from beginning to end in the IDW Sonic comics, so let's take a look. Starline would reveal himself pretty early on in the run during a period where Eggman had lost his memories and had undertaken the persona of the friendly Mr. Tinker. Starline would have Mr. Tinker kidnapped and then forcibly tortured in an attempt to restore him to the Mad Doctor. Ultimately, however, it would only take Mr. Tinker seeing a damaged metal Sonic to bring him back to his senses. And from there, along with a generous gift of 7 Chaos Emeralds, no big deal, Starline and Eggman would begin working together on one of Eggman's most devious inventions, that being the metal virus. Together, Starline and Eggman would create a virus that was capable of converting anybody in its wake into mindless mechanical zombies that would, in theory, obey Dr. Eggman blindly. And while we'll be seeing a lot of the metal virus in this story, if you'd like to see the complete story from the hero's perspective, you can find that on my channel. Now, while Starline and Eggman were working on this, Sonic and Silver would come across an Eggman base where robots were transporting resources out of this old decrepit base and into a mysterious red portal. This portal would continue manifesting during a fight in which Metal Sonic would show up to try to stop Sonic and Silver, and it's shortly after this that our heroes would be introduced to the one and only Doctor Starline. It turns out that Starline is able to create these portals thanks to a thing called the Warp Topaz, which he has incorporated into his glove. It more or less allows him to open a portal anywhere that he wants. And thanks to this, despite the fact that Starline isn't a great fighter, he was able to hold his own against Sonic thanks to the fact that Sonic has a pretty brash nature, and he doesn't always think before attacking. Due to this, Starline could open up a portal, Sonic would run through it without realizing, and rinse and repeat until Sonic would eventually tire himself out. So ultimately, Starline's best asset isn't his physical prowess, but rather it's his mind. He would end up revealing that, in fact, this base is rigged to explode, and Silver had just entered that base while Sonic was fighting with Starline. So Sonic would of course rush in, as the selfless hero he is, to rescue Silver, and with an ear-shattering kaboom, it blows up. With that, Starline will shortly celebrate his victory, and it's a victory that is celebrated just a little bit too early, because he ends up getting yoinked by Eggman through the portal back into their base, and it's here that Starline would start to see a few little cracks in his idol's mind. Eggman refuses to let anybody go after Sonic. That guy is his to deal with. He explains that he could carpet bomb Sonic any day of the week, but he needs to prove his superiority in a way that is better than just mindlessly blowing him up. Not to mention that Starline honestly didn't know what he was going up against, because Silver, thanks to his telepathic powers, was able to shield both he and Sonic from the blast that Starline had created. And so, Starline would take a back seat and hold off on taking things into his own hands for the time being. He would continue to work on the metal virus with Eggman, which would result in Sonic actually getting infected during a fight with Starline's men for hire, Rough and Tumble. This kind of victory is one that Eggman is very much so willing to accept over Sonic. However, don't be fooled, he's not going to give Starline any credit for the help that he had given. This is an Eggman victory, because Eggman's ego is just that big. It'll not only defeat Sonic, but it'll turn him into a mindless zombot at Eggman's mercy. From here, Eggman would reveal a giant ship that he had created that he and Starline would pilot. And honestly, Starline and I share a pretty similar facial reaction to this name because, yeah, Face Ship is a unique name for a giant ship that's also in the shape of Eggman's face. However, this giant metal face would actually be pretty devastating to the world. It would serve as the main way of initially spreading the metal virus, as it would vomit a metallic ooze wherever it was, and this ooze would corrupt any living organism that it touched. From there, essentially the metal virus would spread because the Zombots could just walk and touch things and continue to spread it on as the nanites would continue to replicate. The metal virus, despite being absolutely devastating, wasn't without flaws, and these flaws were revealed pretty early on. It was shown that the Zombots had actually started to respond less and less often to Eggman due to random mutations within the code, and upon realizing how dismissive Eggman was over this, Starline would really start to question if he had done the right thing by tying himself to Eggman. Starline would end up trying to take matters into his own hands once again, despite the fact that that did not go so well for him the first time. It wouldn't be long after searching through Eggman's files that he would learn about the Zeti and their ability to control machines with their minds, and so Starline would go and broker a deal with them. He would secretly plan on using this magic conch to control them, one that Eggman had used in the past to do the same. Now, during this time before the Zeti got involved, Eggman and Starline would continue to work on trying to get the right frequency to control the Zombots. Things would start to get heated, however, between the two doctors when Starline would learn that there is actually no vaccine for this virus, and Eggman has zero plans on making one for he or Starline. To make matters even worse, Sonic would end up showing up, and it wouldn't take much for him to bait Eggman into a fight, causing the two of them to fall into the city of Zombots below. Luckily, there's at least one doctor here who's able to focus on his research and ignore Sonic, that being of course Starline. So Starline manages to find a frequency that would give Eggman at least temporary control over the Zombots before they mutated again. However, this was all for naught, as Sonic would jump through Eggman's chair and effectively destroy all of the research that Starline had not yet backed up to the egg face. Always make sure you back your stuff up to the cloud, guys. Even without control over the Zombots, Eggman would continue to refuse to work on a cure or a vaccine in case the worst case scenario happened. And honestly, I can kind of get why Starline is struggling to keep faith in Eggman, because he's being really dismissive towards something that could ultimately destroy both of them. Thankfully, the two were able to escape from the Zombots after Eggman's chair was destroyed thanks to one of Starline's portals, but due to Eggman's laissez-faire attitude, Starline ends up really going into taking matters into his own hands as he returns to the Lost World, and it's here that he would meet the Zeti once again to finalize that deal that he had started with them. Now, the comic kind of assumes that you've played Sonic in the Lost World at some point. However, I'm willing to bet that most people didn't play that game. So basically, just to give a short recap about the game because it's going to be slightly relevant, Eggman essentially found a lost world, and it's here that he used a magic conch shell in order to control a bunch of creatures that he had met. However, these creatures would end up turning against Eggman, and they would take control of his forces, so Eggman would be forced to work alongside with Sonic. Just remember that because history likes to repeat itself. Now, Zavok, the leader of the Zeti, would pretend to be ready to serve Eggman once again, under the pretense that he's actually plotting his revenge against Eggman. Starline would have no idea about this, the same way that Zavok has no idea that Starline is willing to use a magic conch shell to control he and the Zeti. So pretty shortly after this final meeting, Starline would approach Eggman with his solution to the Zombots, and Eggman, being the egomaniac that he is, he's got no interest in Starline's idea. So Starline just forcibly introduces his new friends through a portal, and it's a very cool looking panel. I'm not crazy about the Zeti, I'm not going to hide that fact from anyone, but this looks cool. Eggman's pseudo-son, Metal Sonic, who, if you remember, had once saved him from his Metal Tinker persona, would rush in to protect Eggman against the Zeti, but unfortunately, due to the Zeti's ability to, control robots, Metal Sonic would be unable to save Eggman this time, and in fact, he would actually be sicked on the Doctor. Starline would try and flex his strength by showing that he is the one who's actually under control here by blowing into the conch shell, and this would immediately backfire on him, as it would follow with him getting headbutted and then clubbed in the back of the head with the same conch. See, the thing is, this conch works pretty well as long as you can blow into it. And like I said before, physical prowess isn't really Starline's thing, so lung capacity isn't really all that big with Starline. Which would mean that Eggman and Starline would have to teleport themselves out of there with Metal Sonic, which would of course leave the Zeti and Zavok, their leader, in control of all 7 Chaos Emeralds and inside of the ship that can spread the metal virus. They would use these Chaos Emeralds to supercharge themselves. So if we look over onto Angel Island, Eggman and Starline would suddenly teleport in, and it's here that they would have to form an unlikely alliance with Sonic and friends in order to defeat the Zeti. I'm getting a little bit of deja vu here, and maybe you can see why I stopped to explain the plot of Sonic and the Lost Worlds. However, Starline isn't actually super eager to share his powers with Sonic and friends, and so he decides he's going to continue to take things into his own hands. Like, taking things into his own hands isn't what led them into this mess to begin with. He would prepare to teleport himself out of here, but Eggman would send Metal Sonic onto Starline, and he would steal his glove and subsequently the warp topaz. Starline would then be yeeted into the portal, and he wouldn't have a way to teleport himself anywhere else afterwards. Following the metal virus, Eggman would have no idea where Starline wound up, and quite honestly, he doesn't seem to care at all about Starline. Starline, meanwhile, would be hiding in his repository where he would be preparing for his next plan. You might think that Starline would hold a grudge against Eggman and he'd be ready to go up against him, but he actually seems a little bit broken here. Starline is ready to give Eggman a victory that he would create thanks to this plan, because in his mind, the way that he sees it, Eggman will finally view Starline as an equal if he can do this. However, in order to get Eggman's attention, Starline would have to build something big, and in order to do this, he would need a bunch of Eggman technology. Unfortunately for him, Starline would be locked out of Eggman's systems, and without the warp topaz, he wouldn't have a way to teleport himself into Eggman's base and just simply steal the stuff. So, Starline would need need to form a team to pull off a heist against Eggman. And if it's going to be a team up against Eggman, it's going to have to be a group of people who have something to gain from going up against Eggman. We would see that Starline's new project would involve something with massive green tubes. However, it'll be a hot second before we get to those. Because Starline is reliant on that Eggman tech to get these green tubes going, Starline would have to pull off a massive heist. And so he would get his group of criminals together. He would pull off a prison break in the Everhold prison. This is a maximum security prison, and I actually don't know why it's in the shape of a guitar either. It's kind of weird because if I had a nickel for every time a piece of Sonic media had a guitar-shaped prison, I would have 2 nickels. And isn't it kind of weird that that's happened twice? And like, it's not even a reference to Archie Sonic or something like that, because this happened in Sonic X, the TV show from the early 2000s. So like, I don't know if there's some kind of reference I'm missing with a prison being in the shape of a guitar, but like, let me know if there is something, because pretty weird. Using a new glove that Starline had devised, he could then mind control the warden into believing that Starline was here for a job interview. And inside of the prison, Starline would meet his future team members. These members are Mimic. He's an octopus who's able to turn into anyone, and he is out to kill another character named Whisper. We then also have Starline's old lackeys, Rough and Tumble, and finally there's Zavok, because Zavok seems obligated to show up in just about any Sonic project these days, whether it be the comics or the video games. From here, the gang would break out of prison, and despite the fact that the warden would try and stop them, and also the prison guards would try and stop them, this gang would have little to no issues when using their combined abilities in order to smash and deceive anyone in their path. The gang would set all of the inmates loose onto the guards, and they would walk away from this burning prison in what is honestly a pretty cool looking panel. Now interestingly, this comic would reference a Sonic video game, and I want to give you a second to try and guess what video game this comic is referencing. Just take a second, because I guarantee you will not be able to guess. If you guess Sonic Heroes, then you are a liar, because nobody ever guesses Sonic Heroes. But here's the thing, Starline plans to steal this tech called Power Cores from Eggman. These power cores come in 3 variants: power, fly, and speed. Each core can give the power associated with their name to anyone who is touching it. Though Starline would tell a little white lie that these cores would actually require special tech that he made to be able to utilize them. With these cores in hand, the group could then infiltrate the Egg Hub, which is essentially a central location for all of Eggman's data. And it's here that Starline would be able to give Zavok control of a portion of Eggman's army. He would also erase Mimic's name from the database, allowing Mimic to go off murdering. I'm not actually totally sure how his name being erased actually helps with anything, because it's not like people will just suddenly forget who he is. And Rough and Tumble just kind of seem to be along for the ride. Together, the group would assault the first Eggman base, and through internal monologues from Starline, we would learn that each member is way too risky to actually keep around, and so Starline is ready to dispose of each of them once he has what he needs from them. After a fight against a pretty cool looking robotic T-Rex that was actually immune to Zavok's mind control, the group would find crates filled with these cores, and Starline would order the gang to load them up onto a truck as he alters the security footage. However, during this, Zavok would end up touching one of the cores, and surprise surprise, it works just fine without any of the tech. The gang would escape, and just before they do, they would end up framing all of this on Sonic. Essentially, Starline would doctor the footage to make it look like it was Sonic. Zavok and Rough and/or Tumble, I'm not actually sure which one is which because it's a real Rod and Todd situation with them, I find, would end up punching the door, leaving a dent that looks like a spin dash, and Mimic, for good measure, would run in, disguised as Sonic, in front of a camera. Back at Starline's base, Starline would continue to work on his glove while also teasing these green bats once again, which just aren't quite ready yet for the public. Then he would show his newest invention. It's the Tricore, a gem that would allow him to tap into all 3 power cores. Quick little tangent, but I actually hate the fact that they're called power cores, because one of the power cores' powers is power, and that's too much power for one sentence. Why couldn't they just be called cores? Because like a power core just sounds dumb. When next we would see Starline, he would be on his computer, and it's here that we would learn that through an old video diary, Starline is planning on taking control of Eggman's army in order to kill off his companions before he can actually fulfill any of the promises he had made to them. And this would of course lead to no witnesses or loose ends to anything that had happened. Interestingly though, the Starline watching this video isn't the Starline that we know, and in fact it's actually Mimic who's taken the form of Starline. Because of course a group of villains can't trust each other, and in this scenario, Mimic is actually pretty right to not trust Starline, considering that Starline was ready to kill him. That is the most times I've ever said Starline in one sentence. Zavok would end up overseeing this, and so Zavok and Mimic would end up planning to use Starline in order to get their end goals, but once they get that, now that they know the truth, they won't fall for his ploy and they'll just dispose of Starline. The gang would end up assaulting Eggman's hub, and it's here that we would see the effects of the power cores in use. Utilizing speed, power, and flight, the group would easily overpower Eggman's forces, and pretty effortlessly they would make their way into the base. Just a quick little side note, but it's really weird seeing anybody use the fly power core who doesn't actually have the ability to fly. Like, they don't have some kind of propeller or like wings or whatever, they just float in the air. And so when I see Mimic flying, he gives off mad Mind Flayer vibes to me. I don't know if it's just all the Baldur's Gate that I played in the last year, but seeing this tentacly dude flying through the air just weirded me right out. Once in the hub, Starline would fudge the data to make it look like this assault was going on due to Sonic, and he would end up giving Eggman the wrong coordinates to go to. It's here that Mimic would then pull a knife onto Starline and reveal that the jig is up. Starline would be forced to erase Mimic, give Zavok his army, and then leave rough and tumble with all of the power cores. This of course would mean that Starline isn't of any use to anybody here, and so his life and his time was up. Fortunately for Starline, his former allies were unaware of the tricore that he had built, which would allow him to give them the slip. Starline would use a combo of all three powers to escape from Rough, Tumble, and Zavok's new bot army, along with Zavok himself. It's during this time while Starline is escaping that he finally seems to have some clear thoughts, and that's that, like Eggman, his thoughts have been pretty fogged due to rivals, and he had not thought this through because honestly, this plan makes no sense. The amount of times that he's had to pull off heists and attacks against Eggman to somehow appease Eggman is just baffling. This was doomed to fail from the start. While Starline is having this realization, Mimic would then erase himself from Eggman's computer, and he would get the heck out of there because, I mean, he's got no reason to hunt down Starline. Shortly after this, Starline would then go to the computer that Mimic was just at, and he would erase Eggman's Sigma base and change ownership over to himself, because Starline is a certified Sigma male. Eggman eventually would figure out what was going on, and he would show up. It's here that he and Zavok would start talking, and he would get pretty dismissive towards Zavok, and so an all-out shooting match would start with Zavok's new army firing upon their old master. During all of this chaos, Rough, Humble, Starline, and Mimic all managed to escape, and if you're curious as to what happened to Zavok after everything was blown up, well, Zavok was left heavily injured, and thanks to his mind control ability, he was able to get a bot to take him into the woods where he could lick his own wounds. Starline would end up going to retreat into the Sigma base, and he would finally decide that he's going to do things for himself. No longer is Starline trying to impress Eggman and get into his good graces. Starline is going to prove himself as a superior replacement to Eggman, and I'm here for that. Now, quick little pause, this isn't the first time that it's shown up in this video, but throughout the comics we've seen this logo show up, and this is the first time I'm going to acknowledge it, and it's honestly the only time I'm going to acknowledge it. This is Starline's logo, and I realized that it's supposed to be his hair, but I spent my first read through of this thinking that it was a skunk tail, and I honestly couldn't figure out why there was a skunk tail with 5 stars in front of it. I'm actually not totally sure why there are 5 stars in front of it. Maybe I'm a little bit dumb, maybe I missed something, but honestly it doesn't look like the most creative of logos, and I just wish they did something cooler with it, considering that Eggman's logo in general is very cool looking, and I feel like we could have done something maybe similar with Starline, I don't know. Alright, fast forward a little bit, and Starline would find himself at the White Park Chateau, and it's here that he would kidnap both Rouge and Tails before Sonic would of course come and help. Now I'm sure that this scene where Sonic fell and is caught by Shadow influenced a whole bunch of Sonic X Shadow shippers, and ultimately this fight would culminate in a giant avalanche coming down, because let's be real here, when have you ever seen a fight happen at some kind of ski lodge where an avalanche doesn't ultimately happen? I'm gonna say, as somebody who does downhill ski, I'm really disappointed at how infrequently avalanches actually happen in the real world. Now, due to that avalanche, they would have to retreat into the chateau, and things would get heated with a fight against Starline, but not before Starline would be able to grab a bunch of Tails' fur. It's at this point that Belle, a creepy puppet who honestly we're going to get more into later, so just for now, she's a creepy puppet that's alive, and that's all you need to know, would kick Starline into the window, and Starline would be engulfed into the white of the avalanche. Through some absolute miracle, because Starline doesn't have a way to teleport himself, Starline would actually survive this avalanche, and he would show that his real plan was to obtain some of Tails' fur. So despite the fact that his bill is injured and he's maybe a little bit under the weather due to all of the snow, Starline has come out somewhat victorious with his plans. A little while more and we would see more of Belle. Belle would find herself in a sticky situation with Zomnom, one of the Deadly Six, coming after her, and this orangutan friend who I honestly think looks really cool. And despite the fact that he's got this really unique design and this fun like hippie vibe to him that really fits his design, I'm pretty sure he has no name. Starline would save the day by hypnotizing Zomdom and making him leave. And unfortunately, he is there to gather data on Bell, so it's not so much that the villain's been destroyed, but more that the villain has been replaced. Starline would end up pricking the orangutan with his spurs, which are filled with some kind of toxin. The toxin that he had in his spurs was just enough to subdue him. However, one more dose of this would kill him. And so, with no other choice, Belle would have to follow along with Starline, who would then take her and fly on out of there. At some point, Belle would fall unconscious, and when she would wake up, she would arise in an absolute horror scene where she is strapped down to a table, and pretty rightfully so, she is terrified. It's here that we would learn, though, that Starline doesn't have any super ill intentions. In fact, he has no plans to disassemble or even kill Belle. In fact, he's more interested in how her mind works. It doesn't take long before Starline ends up talking about Eggman, and that ends up triggering Belle. Belle would lash out and exclaim that Starline took her father from her father being Mr. Tinker, who, yeah, Starline did kind of take away. This would cause a spike of brainwave activity or something similar to that inside of a puppet robot, and Starline would want to see more responses like that. So he would get Belle to explain her creation to him. The somber puppet bot would discuss how much she loved Mr. Tinker and how she enjoyed working with him. Thanks to Mr. Tinker's good reputation within the community, Belle was taken into the very same village, and things were going pretty well for her. However, things of course changed due to the metal virus. People were turned into zombots, but Belle was unaffected due to the fact that she's not a living organism. Once Sonic and friends had resolved the metal virus and people turned back to normal, the same community who had once accepted her no longer wanted her in the village due to their fear of Eggman. Eventually, due to this stigmatization, she would have no choice but to flee from the village, and it's eventually at this point where she would bump into Sonic, and now here we are. Starline is no therapist, and if he was, he wouldn't be a very good therapist because he doesn't care about this story at all, or even seems all that bothered by the fact that he pretty much aided in ruining Belle's life. Instead, he's fascinated by the data that he's gathered, and from here he simply lets Belle go. There would be a quick little tussle with the Chaotix who had come to rescue Belle, but as always, Starline is able to use his glove in order to zoom out of there, basically unscathed, leaving behind a teary-eyed Belle whom Starline had just emotionally destroyed. Finally, after all of this wait and all of the teasing, we would have Starline's big magnum opus, Operation Remaster. This is Starline's big plan to break the ongoing cycle in which Eggman tries to take over the world but gets stopped by our friendly neighborhood Blue Blur. Now, how does Starline decide to revolutionize this cycle and break it? Well, he is going to replace Sonic and friends with his own replacements. That's right, Starline, inside of these test tubes, has created his very own Sonic OCs, and I am so here for it. I love that Starline's big giant idea here is that he is going to create his own Sonic OCs. Using the fur that he had collected along with the data, he had managed to create his own lookalikes. I'm not gonna lie, this feels like way more work than just stopping Sonic with robots, but honestly, this is fun and I'm here for it. Finally, we get to see Starline's test tube babies, and the first one is Surge the Tenric, and I love her so much. Based just on the character description, with her wearing her baggy punk clothes, covered in piercings, having rings and spiked cuffs, she sounds like she would be too much and too busy to look at, but honestly, they pull her off so well. She looks so dang cool, and on top of her punk attitude, Surge also boasts electric powers that she can use, and she takes that kind of rad dude attitude that Sonic has and just cranks it up to 11. She's so much fun. She chews up every scene she's in, but she does it in such a good way. I really enjoy her character, if you couldn't tell. Along with Surge, we would have Kitsunami, or just Kit for short. I actually really love Kit's name. It's a fun combination of Kitsune and Tsunami, and it looks really cool with these water tails that he has control over. And I really want to like this emo boy Kitsune, but he just kind of embodies all of my least favorite aspects of Tails. He lacks any kind of self-confidence, he always seems unsure, he's always looking for validation, and I just kind of want somebody with a bit more of personality, I guess, someone who can carry himself, I don't know. I like the water tails, and it's kind of where it stops. Surge and Kit, however, complement each other really well, both in personality and in power, and after destroying a bunch of badniks together, we would learn that they were in a test course for Starline. Though Surge dealt with this pretty well, she kind of lacks Sonic's compassion and camaraderie as she abandons Kit, who we would learn had to recharge his pack that controls his water powers. Soon, Starline says, Surge will be tested in the field, but she needs to do so in a less grandiose mission. This would cause Surge to get pretty frustrated with Starline, and we would learn that Starline has been keeping her in check by hypnotizing her, making her go to sleep, and he does the same to Kit when Kit realizes what's happening. Once the two of them wake up, Starline then gaslights them into believing that they push themselves too hard, and he's able to try to keep them in line that way. From here, Surge and Kit are sent off to Forest Ridge, and that's a story for when we actually cover these two characters. Meanwhile, however, Starline is camped out in front of a house in Emerald Town. Can you guess whose house this is? Now, of course, this is Tails' house, and it's kind of wild. Like, how big of an ego do you need to have to build a house in the shape of your head? Like, listen, I made fun of the egg face, and so the house face is the exact same kind of target here. Of course, I'm gonna laugh at this. Of course, this is silly. But listen, wouldn't it be absolutely ridiculous if this house, this Tails-shaped house, didn't belong to Tails? Like, imagine you move into a neighborhood and you're going for a walk, and somebody has built a house in the shape of your head. Like, they're just living inside of you. I don't know. I just think that would be funny. Eventually, Surge and Kit would catch up to Starline, who's trying to get into the house. However, none of them can stealthily open this door, and so it means it's time to hurry back to the base, somehow completely unseen despite being inside of a giant city. Though back at the base, things would get kind of interesting. Surge would go on about how she wants to hunt down Sonic, and she would refer to him as a faker, and just in general, she seems to really dislike Sonic. However, her brain in reality would kind of hit her like a brick wall with a snag. Why does she want to do this? Surge has actually never met Sonic before, but it's like there's something implanted inside of her mind, something that just makes her despise Sonic. And it's there that she starts to kind of break as she's like, what the heck is going on? Starline would try to reboot her, but for the first time, his glove wouldn't actually be enough to put her to sleep. Surge would try to fight against it, and eventually she would be forced down by Starline. Once again, when she would awake, Starline would gaslight her about what was going on, but it's just going to show that Starline has done something to her brain, and he's not willing to talk about that. Surge and Kit would continue to go on missions together, and they would grow in notoriety. They would even manage to eventually take out Metal Sonic, and it's this that would finally get Starline back on Eggman's radar. With a little bit of hacking, Starline would announce that he is succeeding Eggman, and with that, every single badnik would be under Starline's control. However, Eggman apparently has a contingency plan for this, and with a swoop, Eggman is down a secret tunnel and he is away. Starline would have finally won, and he finally gets to take Eggman's seat. It's honestly a really cool victory, and I really like it when something like this happens. However, this victory is pretty short, and we would learn that Eggman has a myriad of mechs to choose from in order to stop Starline. I really like this scene where Starline goes from being like incredibly cocky due to his victory to just absolutely sweating buckets as a giant Mecha Eggman shows up in the window and blocks out the sun. It's always fun when they make Eggman really imposing. Now, Surge and Kit wouldn't be able to help out Starline here as they would be too busy with Sonic and friends, which means that Starline would have to go one-on-one against Eggman. It's Doctor against Doctor, and I absolutely love this so much. Eggman's dialogue, when he talks about not expecting this from Starline and calling Starline just a scumbag, really shows that he has no value for Starline in the slightest. Like, it was totally a one-way street where Starline adored Eggman, and Eggman just can't seem to stand him at all. Starline would end up taking control of another giant mech, and it's here that we would get some really awesome splash art with these two mechs going at each other. I think it looks so cool. I love mech fights in my comic books, and this works really well. Eggman doesn't even care really about Starline's plan or that he's kind of doing this for Eggman still. Eggman just wants this to be dealt with so that things can go back to normal and that he can continue to go on with his own plans and feed his own giant ego. Eventually, Eggman would actually end up destroying Starline's mech, and Starline would be forced to use his tricore to finish off Eggman's mech. A mech being blown up around you might stop a lesser man, but Eggman is anything but. From the shadows, Eggman would rise in one of my favorite depictions of the Mad Doctor ever. He just looks so imposing, and I love how his face is always obscured in this page. We'd learn that Eggman is the top dog for a reason. Eggman is the one true super genius here. Everything that he had done was to counter Starline. He knew that Starline would be forced to use his tricore. He knew that that would drain the tricore's power. And he even listened to Starline when Starline still worked for him, and he talked about this plan to create a hypnotizing love, because he incorporated tech to counter that into his goggles. And so Starline has nothing on Eggman. We get to see Eggman in full force, not only as a super genius, but honestly as just physically stronger than Starline. He would smash Starline against the ground in a panel that is equal parts comical and just an absolutely brutal display as he tosses him to the ground. Honestly, Eggman might have gone even further here if not for the fact that he was distracted by Belle and the fact that the tunnel they were in was starting to collapse in on itself. Belle would try to get Starline to come, but Starline just wasn't having it. He was broken and reeling from his failure. He would sit there struggling to deal with what had just happened. He had a loss on such a monumental scale after such a long time, meticulously planning everything out. Eggman, who he had always believed had this laissez-faire, not caring attitude, had actually listened to Starline, had actually used what he knew about Starline to create a counter to Starline, and so that's it. Starline lost, and the tunnel would collapse in on him. It would crush Starline, and that is all we know. As far as we know, Starline is effectively dead. Now, this is of course a comic, so Starline's likely going to come back, but as far as we know, he's been crushed to death, and that's honestly one of the most gruesome displays I've ever seen in Sonic, period. We would see Starline briefly show up once more as a quote-unquote ghost of sorts inside of Surge's mind, where he would torment her a little bit more. This, however, ends with a really cute scene where Kit hugs Surge, and I adore this. And so that there is Starline. I really enjoyed making this video on him. He's a really fun villain character, and I like seeing a villain who doesn't quite seem to have plot armor like Eggman does. Like, Starline can screw up, Starline can be beat up, Starline can fail, but Starline can also succeed, and I think that makes him a really compelling character. We get to see him go from a lackey to a supervillain in his own rights, and to even for a brief moment superseding Eggman before everything topples down and he is completely destroyed. And honestly, if not for him, we wouldn't have Surge and Kit, who are arguably some of the best things to come out of IDW Sonic. And honestly, the main reason why I made this video was so that I could establish them, so that I can go on to make a video about Surge and Kit without things being too confusing. Now, before we close off, I have some little fun facts and whatnot that I'd like to share. Starline is very likely based on a glitch from Knuckles and the Chaotix. It's the same glitch that I've actually spoken about before on my video about Dr. Fenativis, who showed up in the Archie comics. And honestly, I see it a lot more in Fenativis' character than I do in Starline's character when it comes to this kind of weird white Knuckles. However, one thing that I actually thought was really interesting that I didn't realize until a little bit later is that Starline is a platypus and Knuckles is an echidna. The platypus and echidna families are actually pretty close together, and they are some of the only mammals on this planet who lay eggs. And so there is actually this link between the two characters that I think is rather interesting. So even though Starline doesn't physically look like this glitch, I can see why they actually chose a platypus, and I quite like that. Not to mention, and I'm sure I'm going to talk about this again when I talk about Surge and Kit, but Surge is based on the Ashura glitch from Sonic 2, and I think they did a really good job at incorporating the green and black into her character. She's also a Tenric, which looks incredibly similar to a hedgehog, and from what I read, Kit comes from a glitch where writer Ian Flynn experienced tails turning blue as a kid. However, I can't really find much else on that. Despite that though, I do think it's really cool to have this kind of trio of characters who at one point all work together, who are all based on glitches from old video games. It's kind of fun. And that there is the end. It's been a hot minute since I covered something IDW, and I wanted to start it off with something really interesting. I hope you enjoyed this because I had a lot of fun making it. If there's anything that I missed or anything more that you would like to see in the future, then please let me know. Hopefully you had a good time with this, and it would be great if you could like, subscribe, or do any of that fun stuff. Of course though, at the end of the day, I can't tell you what to do, and I just hope that you have a good one.